This is Morning Perfect Base. I'm Van Velding. Today's project is the library. As you can see here on these signs, I have some back of the envelope math here for all of the materials I'm going to need. It is a lot of materials. We're also going to be making some enchanting tables. I am going to look around here in Perfect Base 4 and see what I've got. Whatever I do not have here, I'm going to be going ahead and doing in Perfect Base 3. I'm going to check it out. See if there's anything in the old base that I can use to get this done. The deal is there are going to be 8 enchanting tables with bookshelves around them of various numbers. The deal is that in Minecraft, the number of bookshelves that are by your enchanting table determine the enchantments, the quality. But sometimes you don't have the enchantments you want. So the deal is by putting different enchantments in different books around the enchanting table, it's going to give me a graduation of the different enchantments I can get, because I believe the enchantments you get are randomly generated when you enchant the previous thing, so you can't do anything about it unless you enchant the next thing. So just trying to use the large amount of space that I have put aside for the library to give me as much flexibility as I possibly can whenever I am doing enchanting. The actual article for today, the actual thing I'm going to be talking with you about, is the Amazon rainforest. As you may have heard this week, the Amazonian rainforest is on fire. The Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, ran on a platform of developing the rainforest for ranchers and farmers. And then as president, he rolled back protections that prevented developing the rainforest. When the head of Brazil's Space Research Center reported that there was a massive deforestation happening because of the development, Bolsonaro fired him. So then eventually someone asked Bolsonaro, because the fires in the Amazon are up 83% over last year. They're the worst that we have seen since we started counting. They're like, hey dude, what's up with that? And he's like, oh, it's just the burn season. And obviously that explanation falsely equates all burning as being the same and dodges the question of why there is so much more of it under his administration. But the only reason Bolsonaro doesn't talk about it is because it's harder for people to stop what he's doing when he won't even admit he's doing it. I guess I can earmark a later episode for how we are in the end game of dishonest politicians and only absolute fools would believe they could discern the lies from the truth. But today, I gotta patch that in. Today, we are talking about the Amazon and climate change. Folks have been, reasonably upset about it. I mean, for starters, the biodiversity of the Amazonian rainforest is of scientific value. There could be some life forms in there that are worth studying and which could provide us with scientific insight. Also, people live there. When the G7, a collection of mostly European nations, resolved to pledge money to help protect the Amazon, Bolsonaro is like, that's colonialism. And when you consider he is a Portuguese-speaking... Oh god, I have a lot of fucking books in here. Fuck, okay. All right, that's great. That might save me a lot of trouble, actually. Right, he is a Portuguese-speaking Roman Catholic who is literally allowing the destruction of the homes of indigenous peoples. When you reflect on that, you realize the exact kind of high art trolling this generation of micro-Mussolinis are capable of. If there was any artistic intent or even basic intelligence behind it, I would respect it a little bit, but it's just a naked, cynical, solipsistic play. So fuck him. So again, he's claiming that he totally wants to fight the Amazon fires, you guys. But, he just won't take European aid money because, it's colonialism. And, the president of France, it was so mean to him. Trust me, I'm sure Bolsonaro would have totally started putting out those fires and stopping the development if Emmanuel Macron hadn't said something as vicious and imperialistic as, let me check my notes. Yes, that the burning of the Amazon is worth discussing at the G7 conference. I assume the original French is fucking savage beyond the ability of this simple Yankee to comprehend. Regardless, some of the freaking out is misplaced. People are saying that the Amazon is the lungs of the earth, and you can't call a singular rainforest That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter so much. But that's not entirely true. Like the Gungans and the people of Naboo, why? Okay, the world exists in a complementary relationship. Plants are like the people of Naboo, conscientious, helpful, a little complacent, and running on an improbably large power source. For the plants, it's the sun. For the people of Naboo, it's that giant fuck-off reactor with the timed force fields and what we can only call the Darth Maul hole. For the purposes of this analogy, the people of Naboo can also turn atmospheric CO2 into carbon biomass into oxygen in the presence of giant fuck-off reactors. And animals are like the Gungans, just garbage, utterly dependent on their counterparts, fucking the whole thing up, poor grasp of geology, turning oxygen into CO2 and biomass into shit. Let's call the oxygen Padme decoys, and we can call CO2 Jar Jar nonsense. Biomass is the potential of this franchise, and let's just keep shit, except it also includes dead leaves, Darth Maul's decaying legs, and a man who could have done Senator Amidala right. In fact, part of this cycle is that all of the shit and decaying stuff is eventually processed back into Jar Jar nonsense waste products to complete the cycle. Imagine a line of Jar Jars, each with their little ducky faces buried bill deep in... Okay, actually do not imagine the Gungan centipede. Also, I'm using plants as an inaccurate catch-all for photosynthesizing organism and animals as an inaccurate catch-all for organisms. How do you get in here? Did they change the light values on these things? I used to only have things spawn in here for zombie raids, which are shenanigans in their own right. I feel like maybe they tweaked the light level of the little glow rods that I get from the end. I don't know. Regardless, I'm using animals as an inaccurate catch-all for organisms that eat plants and other animals and make shit. So surely if you're going to come at me for analogies, it's not going to be that one. So when people say, hey, the Amazon is the lungs of the planet, it means that they're the reverse lungs of the planet. But whatever. They've taken all that Jar Jar nonsense and they give us pure Padme decoys as a result, which is just great news for those of us who breathe Padme decoys. And of course, the Gungans turn the Padme decoys back into Jar Jar nonsense. The good news is that, as with the Star Wars franchise, this back and forth has gone on in near equilibrium for millennia. I mean, that's what it feels like anyway. But some of the Star Wars shit, presumably like the Christmas special and Maul's balls, get trapped in the soil of the Arctic tundra and never get turned into Jar Jar nonsense. So that means that long term, we've got a lot of extra Padme decoys floating around. Thousands of years worth of Padme decoys. So it doesn't matter how many more Padme decoys the people of Naboo are making. Hell, much like Star Wars itself, if all the forests of Earth stopped making Padme decoys, we would be set for Padme decoys in Star Wars until all of us died. The problem in the environment, as with the prequel trilogies, is all of the Jar Jar nonsense. It fucks with the sunlight and it keeps it from getting out of the planet. The temperature goes up, weather patterns change, the climate changes. Yes, Jar Jar, you caused 2 little bitty accidente, din banished. So yes, we're making fewer Padme decoys, and that's bad, but we're also getting rid of less Jar Jar nonsense, and we are going to hit critical Jar Jar nonsense long before we run out of Padme decoys. So let's talk about that, the real problem. The Amazon removes Jar Jar nonsense, but remember all that stored Star Wars shit I mentioned earlier with Maul's balls? When that shit is finally freed by deforestation and mixed with Padme decoys, Gungans break it down into more Jar Jar nonsense. I mean, yeah, this all comes back to Jar Jar nonsense because Jar Jar nonsense is killing the planet as the comfortably habitable place we know it. Something tells me an Old Republic Galactic Empire analogy for pre- and post-climate changed Earths is probably going a bit too far, so I'll just skip that. That the release of Jar Jar nonsense from deforestation in the bad is not debatable, but it's actually worse in other places. In the far north, freezing cycles prevent the breakdown of Star Wars shit, and has for thousands of years. There are thousands of years worth of potential Jar Jar nonsense locked into Russian permafrost, and the warming caused by Jar Jar nonsense is actually releasing more Jar Jar nonsense. Initially, The Jar Jar nonsense released from thawed Star Wars shit wasn't even in our Jar Jar nonsense calculations. In a few years, though, its annual release will rival the annual release of Jar Jar nonsense from China's factories. And you know those guys are busily converting Star Wars shit into bootleg Jar Jar nonsense. Warming due to Jar Jar nonsense in the atmosphere also causes the melting of glaciers and ice sheets. And ice is white and actually reflects light back into space. As it melts, darker oceans that have replaced that ice absorb the energy instead, warming the planet even more. That is a loss of albedo. I don't want to say something like our planet is literally turning from the light side and the melting of glaciers reflects the destruction of the Jedi Order and the Empire's turn to the dark side. But I'm saying it creates another feedback loop where climate change removes more mediating influences on climate change. The deforestation, removing the Amazon to raise Gungans, also gives that area a lower albedo, and it absorbs more heat. Plus, you get all the Jar Jar nonsense that the Gungans bring with them. And since we are on the Amazon rainforest again, let's talk about water. Water doesn't really have an example in this analogy, so let's just call it water. When the water falls on the people of Naboo in the Amazon rainforest, they drink it, use it, excrete it, and then pass it on to the next group of people. It's not gross, it's nature. This process, possibly called the Naboo people's piss chain, in the rainforest transport waters to adjacent areas which may not have a local source of water. Once you cut down enough of the rainforest, the piss chain is broken, and only the Naboo people close to water sources can get water. The rest just dry up and die. When you break the Naboo people's piss chain, it begins a real process that's actually called forest dieback. And we can agree that even though it means the rainforest is dying off without further human intervention, it is a much better term, albeit a drier one. So the thing is, this Jar Jar nonsense, this CO2, this carbon dioxide, is not just going to kill old folks from heat exhaustion, make parents who leave their babies in their car who would have realized it in the nick of time instead find little dead bodies. Higher temperatures kick insect metabolisms into high gear. They grow faster, they eat more, and that includes the insects that feed on crops. And it feels condescending to mention the obvious fall off in crops from heat and lack of water. That's the real flagship issue of the slow but inexorable rise of Emperor Palpatine, driven not exclusively but principally and critically by human-generated Jar Jar nonsense. We're just going to call it climate change for simplicity. And that's before Jar Jar nonsense literally starts making us stupider. When we started the industrial era, atmospheric concentrations of Jar Jar nonsense didn't get above 300 parts per million. About 5 or 6 years ago, we hit 400. This year, we hit 415 parts Jar Jar nonsense per million. You don't have to do all of the math on that, but human-elevated Jar Jar nonsense production, attributed admittedly almost entirely to George Lucas, jumped from a rise of less than 1 part per million a year to over 2 parts per million a year. That's bad. And it's getting worse. Don't let The Force Awakens and Last of the Jedi fool you. The buildup of Jar Jar nonsense continues apace, and our worst milestone tracks closely with production of The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens isn't code for anything like Trump entering the Republican primaries or anything. It's literally the 2015 movie Star Wars The Force Awakens. Back on track though, at 1,000 parts per million, human cognition drops by about 21%. I don't know if that's a sharp drop or a gradual one, but given that we have been just god-awful, as a civilization, at dealing with this Jar Jar nonsense with our faculties ostensibly intact, except I guess for that one generation that grew up breathing leaded air, I don't think we have much cognition to burn in solving this problem. Oh no. Oh, fuck. So the deal is that I've got these 8 enchanting tables, and then I have all of the diagrams out for the bookshelves to work with them, and I designed it so that certain cubby holes of those enchanting tables would share walls for efficiency. But when I actually put them down in the library, I made each one have its own individual cubby hole that put 2 rows back to back instead of having them share a row of bookshelves. I did a lot of math to make that work because it was cool and efficient, and it's kind of a challenge. It's fun. Now I gotta fucking do... Okay. Whatever. That change in Jar Jar nonsense concentrations affects plants as well. As levels rise, the iron and protein content of staple foods like wheat, corn, rice, and soybeans drops. Even if we can still grow enough food to feed the world's population, they might still be malnourished and vulnerable to diseases. I mean, you remember how we froze moles balls in the permafrost of Russia? Well, it turns out that diseases nestle and wait well in the severed testicular sacs of Dathomirian males stored at sub-zero temperatures until they thaw. A couple years ago, a thawed deer carcass gave other deer anthrax, who in turn passed it on to a kid who died of it. Even in temperate areas, brain-eating amoebas are spreading and killing Americans. That's not from anything, it's literal amoebas who get in your brain through your nose and try to eat your brain, and your immune system makes your brain swell to fight them, and then you die. Scientists have made bread out of millennia-old yeast. Microorganisms can survive for thousands of years, and we have no idea what could come out as a result of the northern thaws. Everything under the ice is Star Wars shit, and guys, some of it is worse than Jar Jar nonsense. Let me speed this up though. When we talk about ice sheets and glacier melts, we are talking hundreds of billions of tons of ice. That shifts weights on tectonic plates and causes earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis. I can't get into it now, but the destruction of human inhabitants of Doggerland, a Britain-European land bridge that may have been a catastrophic result of a glacier melt-induced slides, is worth looking at. And ice sheets and glaciers in Greenland and the Antarctic are already melting 4 to 6 times faster than we expected. Our oceans are warming about 16.9% faster than we expected. That means, I misread that. They are warming 40% faster than we expected. That means that oceans are hotter. They take up more volume. Sea levels rise just a little bit more. And our oceans, which are to the entire world what the Amazon is to trees, absolutely house Jar Jar nonsense, sucking up about 25% of all the Jar Jar nonsense the world tanks on behalf of an ungrateful humanity. But when it's warm, the water absorbs less, so there's more feedback. Destruction of the Jedi Temple, Imperial March, Rise of Darth Vader, etc., etc. Look, we should do everything in our power to push our politicians to adopt a Green New Deal or environmentally conscious policy that makes us want to hold other nations accountable so that everyone drops their net Jar Jar nonsense emissions down to zero. And whether that's planting more people at Naboo, or sealing tons of Star Wars shit into a vault, or just not burning unnecessary fuels that put Jar Jar nonsense into the air to own the libs, whatever. I hope we can do those things, but we can also prepare. And I know the people who care the most about climate change are the first ones to curl their lips in disdain at the slightest survivalist sentiment. So ignore spiking food prices, the floods that might displace 1 in 16 Americans, an infrequent but likely year where the Gulf Coast is hit with a barrage of Category 5 hurricanes like in 2005. Forget tsunamis that hit Pacific Coast cities while they're trying to adjust to rising sea levels. Ignore the immunocompromised refugees with ancient diseases stowed thoughtlessly by the government adjacent to the safe inland area where you live. Ignore federal emergency management budgets that can't cover environmental crises we have now, and the thought of U.S. Marines trying to hold shipping lanes from the Suez to the Panama Canals to secure food supplies and then finally dramatically failing. You should always be preparing for disasters. You should have some food, a few days of water, some supplies. You should have an evacuation plan for a day, for a week, for if something happens to the building where you live. Talk with other people you know who live in other areas. Make sure you can go there and that they can come to you. And make sure that they're preparing, so if they have to evacuate, they don't come to you empty-handed. There's an episode of the original Twilight Zone called The Shelter. It's a good one. Another good one is Doctor Who's Turn Left. I'm not suggesting that you build a bomb shelter, but I'm suggesting that you prepare. And I know it's taboo because Americans hate acknowledging our vulnerability. We hate looking like we're worried about something or like we're anxious about something or looking like idiots because we prepared for a disaster that never came. But I would ask for you to reconcile that with the certainty of climate change. We're not stopping Emperor Palpatine from coming to power. He is Supreme Chancellor. He's running the place. He hasn't dissolved the Senate yet, but you can damn well bet he will if we don't stop him. And there's no shame in hedging and finding a quiet little spot out on the rim where you can be safe if we don't. This is Morning Perfect Base, Van Velding. Keep asking questions and keep learning.